In this final lecture, we're going to look at the future of the Middle East. What are the trends that will likely extrapolate out over the next 2 decades, and what will it mean for the rest of the world? As always, the Middle East is at a crossroads. With major social and demographic changes ahead, the Middle East may evolve into free societies amongst some of its states, while others might stay mired in underdevelopment. After this lesson, you'll understand that the destiny of Western countries is now intertwined more than ever with that of the Middle East. In certain ways, you can consider that its future is our future. So anyone who tries to predict the events of the next 20 years will inevitably be wrong. The trajectory of this region has always zigged when others thought it would zagged. If you would ask someone in the 1950s or 1960s what the future would be, they would think of the Middle East as becoming more nationalistic, increasingly secularizing, because that was the ethos amongst many of those states at the time, and falling under the sway of the United States or the Soviet Union in the Cold War. Many would have expected that 1 or 2 generations later, political Islam would be a rising dominant force. The Soviet conflict or the Cold War conflict would be history. And now it's largely along a trajectory of dealing with autocratic governments versus religious governments versus destability. So to try to guess the future based on today's current trajectories might be a bit foolhardy. Nevertheless, let's do our best. Well, what are some trends that we do know of now? In the second decade of the 21st century, the Middle East does face extreme challenges. There's an extremely high birth rate coupled with chronic unemployment, which means there aren't enough jobs for the younger generation, and the situation is likely to get worse. According to the 2012 Freedom House report, the Middle East consistently ranks near the bottom of the list of the world's nations in terms of education, gender equality, and human rights. Meanwhile, the Arab Spring has shown that authoritarian regimes are not safe from revolution. Social media and global interconnectedness have loosened their grip on power, perhaps permanently. However, we see that the protests of the Arab Spring, which were against chronic unemployment and lack of opportunity, weren't something that just came out of the last few years, but are deeply entrenched issues. So solving them isn't going to be a simple matter of policy change or UN developments, but these problems and difficulties are far more long-term than that. Okay, well, what does that mean for the people living in different Middle Eastern regimes now? It depends on which country you're talking about, and it depends on which government structure you're talking about. There are 2 classes of authoritarian countries in the Middle East. There are republics and monarchies. The republics, such as Syria, Algeria, Egypt, Yemen, and Tunisia, arguably, according to some analysts, are more likely to collapse in the next 20 years than monarchies, which include Jordan, Morocco, Saudi Arabia, and the rest of the Arab Gulf states. Why is that? That seems a little counterintuitive because one would think of a republic as having greater human rights and being a more advanced, a more developed country than a monarchy, which sounds like a medieval throwback. Part of the reason is that the republics hold elections, and although these elections are typically rigged or heavily weighed in favor of the incumbent, they at least give a pretense of caring about citizens' opinions. In contrast, the monarchies are ruled by a single person or family, and their cult of personality can ironically shield them from many of the problems experienced by republics. Here are the monarchies that I mentioned earlier. Another factor that will largely determine how fast these countries reform outside of their governing structure is again coming to the issue of oil. Oil-rich nations like Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, the way they're able to maintain their stability is what Thomas Friedman describes as essentially bribing their citizens into compliance. I mentioned earlier the vastly government-supported petroleum for cars and gasoline, and other ways that the governments give support and subsidization for basic life necessities in order to keep their citizenry happy. Their change over time is more likely to be a slow evolution rather than a violent uprising. However, oil-poor nations like Syria, and really any country in the Levant along the eastern Mediterranean, like Lebanon and Israel, oil-poor nations like Syria can only violently repress their citizens into conformity. And this is the means by which the civil war is being fought, where Bashar al-Assad isn't bribing citizens back into supporting him rather than supporting rebels. He's using iron-fisted politics. This model has already shown its instability in Libya with Muammar Gaddafi's reign and could be repeated across different countries in the coming decades. Well, what does the future hold for the Middle East? Whatever happens, unquestionably, we have seen through these 25 lectures that it's going to continue to be a dynamic area, both blessed and cursed by its location at the center of the world. Throughout history, from the Bronze Age, when it occupied a central trade nexus between the Far East and Europe, going into imperial periods where the Middle East was a contested ground between Rome and Persia, going through the Middle Ages where it occupied important holy sites such as Jerusalem, which meant armed military conflict with the Crusades, moving through history with the Ottoman Empire, then different colonial powers trying to gain access to its land and consolidating its holdings, particularly after the discovery of oil, then entering the diplomatic crises of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, where any type of important international diplomatic issue typically involves these two countries, we see that the Middle East occupies vital importance for global affairs, regardless of where you happen to live in the world. So whatever happens in the Middle East has ripple effects throughout the globe. So let's hope that the future of the Middle East, in whatever form it might have, is a success story, and it can recall its brighter moments in history, which we've seen numerous times here in this course throughout the long history of this region, and not a return to the darker chapters of its history. Thank you for listening to these lectures. I really appreciate it, and I hope you enjoyed learning more about the Middle East.